Hello, everybody. My name is Abby McCulley, and I work for Church Communications as the Director of Events and Membership. And today I am joined by Japheth. Japheth serves as the Customer Success Squad Lead at Church Media Squad. And we are so excited to be here with you today. We're going to talk about graphic design. We're going to talk about creative ministry and what that means for you in a pastoral role. So, Japheth, thank you so much for being with me today.
Oh, it is my pleasure. I am excited to be here and excited to help shed a little bit of light on this topic of working with remote design teams and how do you do that when you don't have a background in design and don't have, I'll start off by saying I'm not a graphic designer.
Right.
So it's kind of a fun little segue in there to shed some light on this from a non-designer's perspective. And hopefully we can give you guys some tips on how to make this process smoother and make it more understandable and relatable when you don't have that background and don't have the time to go to college and get an art history degree.
Exactly. Yeah, it can be overwhelming. It can be a lot of technical terms, and it can almost feel like, well, if I can't know everything about it, I'm not going to bother learning anything about it. So yeah, we just want to make it a little bit more approachable and just give you some tips to help make your process more efficient, save you some time, maybe save you some frustration. But as Japheth, you mentioned, you're not a graphic designer. You are a customer success squad lead at Church Media Squad. They're some of our friends that offer graphic design services, video services. But tell us what you do. Tell us what your job consists of. What do you do all day?
So as kind of a simplistic explanation of my title, I focus on client experience at Church Media Squad. And I discovered early on that with the people that we're typically working with, a great percentage of them do not have any kind of background in design. But as the nature is with a lot of churches, you're just handed something. You're handed a title, you're handed a hat that you have to wear as part of your job description, which is ever changing. And I noticed that a lot of the frustrations that our churches were having were because of this divide in between designers and non-designers. And how do we communicate and how do we work together? So part of elevating client experience is helping to give you some of the tools that you need to get off the ground and working with a remote design team. So that way you can get results quicker with us. And so that way you can have a more pleasant experience from the start versus having to jump in and figure things out and trial and error and end up being frustrated and, okay, well, this isn't going to work. And just carrying on that frustration that you've likely been having up to the time that you elected to subscribe to Church Media Squad, and then even beyond that. So it's been a very unique development of that from just beyond training, okay, this is our system and our process and how we do things, to speaking to that in a more, I would say in a more generic sense of how to work with a remote design team.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that gives you a very unique perspective. I think it gives you a very well-rounded perspective because you've worked with churches of all sizes. You've worked with different members of different church teams, people who sometimes maybe have all of their processes in place and know how to do this and just hit the ground running. And then also people who
or have none of them.
None of them, exactly. Just kind of coaching them through that and like teaching them the whole process along with getting the work done. So I feel like you really are the expert here. And as we get started, before we get into some of the more technical things, maybe just explain why creative ministry is important. Maybe some of the ways that you have seen the work that you get to do actually impact churches.
Yeah. So in the world that we live in today, a lot of the work that we are doing didn't exist 15 or 20 years ago.
Yes.
Like you basically had to be a mega church to even consider having a graphic designer on staff. But with the way that social media has developed, with the way that the pandemic has shaped a lot of churches to going online with their services and to realizing that they needed to have an online presence to begin with, it has put a very heavy demand on the way that we look and the way that we communicate in terms of our social presence, in terms of our media. So graphic design in its essence is problem solving. Graphic design helps you solve a communication problem to how to communicate either a broad vision or a very specific, hey, we're having a men's barbecue this Thursday at 7:00. And the way that you do that, the way that you communicate in a digital environment says just as much about you as the way that you communicate in an interpersonal environment. If I were to say, we have a men's barbecue this Thursday at 7.
Who's going to come? Nobody. Who wants to show up?
Who's going to come?
No, yeah.
If I say, oh gosh, we have a men's barbecue this Thursday at 7.
You can come if you want.
You can come if you want. Like, it's not going to be this big deal. Hey, we have a men's barbecue this Thursday at 7. Like, the way that you communicate digitally has just as much nuance as all of the body language and tone and inflection that we have in interpersonal communication like this. And so learning how to speak some of those digital terminologies, learning and paying attention to the tone that you are projecting on a digital level or even on a print level, things that you're handing out to your congregations can really change engagement, can change the attractiveness of the message, can hit a target audience, or completely miss your targeted demographic. Like, I believe that we've all been given a platform, and the reason that some of the variations exist in the body of Christ is because we are there to service the people that we're in the neighborhood of, right? If you are in a large urban center and you've got a very rural feel about your church, and that's not what you're going for, it might be missing its target audience here, and graphic design can help you solve that problem.
Yes.
It is that intermediary of saying, hey, you're coming across as really aggressive in your communications when you're talking like this.
Right.
It gives you that option to say, oh, okay. And so that's why graphic design is so important, why the creative ministry is so important within a church today. And this stems to even beyond graphic design to your social media. Your social media and how you run your social media can convey that stuff. The tone of your worship, what you're using for lights and stage and set, and the fun thing is that while there's a lot of debate about what's right and wrong, there really, as long as you are making sure you are conveying the vision of the church correctly, there really is no right and wrong. There's right and wrong to specific demographics. If you're wanting to reach, let's say, an older demographic, having a dark church with lots of lights and fog and heavy rock, pop rock worship might not work as well. But doesn't mean that that's necessarily wrong if your target demographic is that younger audience where that's the feel, that's the vibe that you're going for. So everything like that on a nuanced level of communicating your vision needs to be looked at, and it needs to be addressed with a much more, I would say it needs to be addressed with a much more professional touch than it has been in the decades in the history of the church prior to probably about 2005, maybe even 2000 if we wanted to go back that far. But I think in 2000, we were still using overhead transparencies at my church. So
right. No, people's expectations have certainly changed. I mean, people didn't expect professionalism on the internet when it was, when all this stuff was first coming to be a thing. But now the bar is higher. And I think approaching graphic design and sort of dubbing it as a communication issue and a problem-solving issue sort of bridges the gap between the pastors and the creative team. Because ultimately,
100%.
pastors are communicators, right? And so if you just look at graphic design as a means and a tool for better communication, that sort of takes away the oh, I don't understand, this is creative, this is artsy, it just sort of connects the two a little bit better, I think.
It really does. And the first thing that I'll point out in this, and I'm sorry to do this to you pastors, my mom is a pastor. I have seen her walk through so much in her life as a pastor. I hate to put something more on your plate, but as the pastor, it is your responsibility to establish that vision and to help your team see that vision and to help them be able to carry out the vision of the church. I hate putting more work on your plate because I realize there's so much there. But the beauty of working with a graphic design professional, whether you are hiring a freelancer, whether you have a volunteer in your church, whether you're hiring an on-staff graphic designer, or whether you're outsourcing graphics to an individual or to a design firm like Church Media Squad, having that professional in there, if you can establish the creative vision and learn to communicate that effectively, they can come in with their professional tool set and take all of the work off of your plate of having to do that design work in and of itself.
Yes, for sure. That definitely makes the whole process way, way more smooth. So what advice would you give to the pastor or the director who's maybe over the creative team, or maybe you're outsourcing some, an organization like Church Media Squad, working with a freelancer, maybe you do have a graphic designer on staff, but regardless of the situation, there's a million different scenarios. There are tools and ways, there's language you can learn, ways you can learn to communicate to make that entire process a little less painful, to make it, and to feel like you're accomplishing the goals that you want to accomplish without like sort of hitting that wall. So what would you say are some good ways to communicate about this?
Yeah. Step one is clearly establish your vision. Now, on a broad sense of the level of the church, that seems to be more like high-level pastor work to do. But on a more nuanced level, we see a lot of sermon series graphics come through, where we're working to develop a theme for a sermon series that you're going to be preaching on for the next 6 or 8 weeks. The church is going to have some quote-unquote branding that's going along with this, some print materials, like it's going to be the theme of the church that everybody's going to see for a little while. One thing that I've seen a lot of churches struggle with is they come in expecting the designer to do the creative work and figure out the vision of that. And they end up going through several rounds of revisions, and then they take it back to the lead pastor, and the lead pastor says, that's not what I want.
Right.
And so then they take a little bit of feedback back to the designer and say, basically start over again. And after 4 or 5 times of doing that, everybody on both sides of the party is very frustrated in this process. Taking the time while you're developing that sermon series, or whether if it's a big event, Christmas, Easter, like the big Super Bowl Sunday, if you will, church events, like where we've got a big draw, taking the time to establish that vision, get on Google, get on Pinterest, get on Instagram, see what other churches are doing. Church Media Squad actually has a resource library that we call bythesquad.com, where it is designs that we have turned into templates that you can actually purchase to use. That's a great resource for you to look through to find that inspiration, to figure out what it is you want the vision of this project to look like. Having that established to begin with 100% will take a lot of the stress off of your team and also off of the designer that you're working with. It's okay if you change that mid-stride, by the way. We totally get that kind of stuff happens. But when it's more of a scavenger hunt, it gets to be very, very uncomfortable for everybody that's involved and working in the process. And sometimes they might not even have the wherewithal to say, hey, if you just tell me what you want, like we can't read your mind here. Right. So establishing the vision, first and foremost, that would be my first recommendation. The second thing I would recommend in this, we actually have a motto at Church Media Squad. It's one of our internal squad goals, that we take art seriously, not ourselves.
Love that.
And whether you're working with Church Media Squad or anybody else, the essence of that is that we are here to serve you. And we're not letting our artistic egos get in the way of, well, we created this. We spent so much time and effort creating this. Why don't you like it? Find somebody that's not going to be offended. Find somebody that has got a professional enough stance on the service that they're offering, that their pride, that their ego is not going to get in the way of the work that you're doing. That can be a hindrance to that process. And if it's a volunteer within your church, God bless them for wanting to volunteer. Amen. But be very careful in that regard, because you get into that, and sometimes volunteers, you got to treat them with those kid gloves a little bit more. Yeah. You got to be careful of what you say and how you present things. And if they make something and you don't like it and you say, hey, I don't like this, it can be a little bit risky. Yes. So now we circle back to step one in the process, where as long as you've got your creative vision established and you're able to clearly communicate, hey, this is the style and vibe we're going for on this project, then it's going to make it a lot easier for that volunteer to step up to the plate and to hit something, to at least hit the pitch that you're throwing at them. But be very careful who you source this kind of work to, because in the event that you don't like it, sometimes there's conflict there. And working with a professional who has a reputation for being a professional can be a huge win for you and for your team, because their ego's not going to get in the way.
Definitely. Definitely. Yeah, I think that's super important.
So, yeah, those 2 points I would give in terms of the front end work on this. The next step is, what do we do when we get back something that we might not like or that needs adjusting? Right. Do I really need to go back to college and get an art history degree so I can articulate the difference between Art Deco and mid-century modern in order to communicate with my designer?
Yeah. Sounds like a lot of work.
No, you don't. It's way too much work. But what I've discovered is that there's actually, and a lot of design sources would back this up, there's really only 4 elements to a design.
Okay.
So when you're looking at a design that your designer has presented you, if you look at these 4 elements, you might be able to articulate and give them better feedback when you're breaking it down instead of just saying, no, I don't like this.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds super helpful.
So those 4 elements are simply the fonts that are used, the placement of all of the elements within the piece, the imagery that is used, and the color scheme.
Okay, see, that's super
If you can pick on... That's everything. Like, what else is there to it? Now, you can get super existential about this and talk about the emotional tone of this, but that really just boils down to the combination of imagery and color scheme.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
You might like the fonts and the placement of everything within this. You just feel that the emotional tone is too dark because the imagery is not conveying happiness and bright colors like you thought it would. Now all you have to do is say, hey, can we change the imagery to something more this instead of this? Can we lighten up the color scheme and use something more happy sunshine summertime instead of these darker, heavier color tones? Right. And now your designer actually has something to build on. It's constructive criticism. Yes,
constructive criticism. That's tangible. That's actual pieces of information, not just like, this feels wrong. I'm not a fan of this. And that's so helpful because now you have language for it, right? Okay, so walk us through maybe, I'm sure everyone who's listening knows what a font is, placement, but just walk us through, just a little more specifically what each of those pieces actually is.
So each of those pieces, when we look at, for instance, the imagery of a piece, sometimes we want landscape, photography. We want a more photography-based imagery. Sometimes we want something that is a little bit more, I would almost say a little bit more design-heavy, that doesn't actually have any imagery in it at all. You're wanting shapes and tones and colors to convey what you're wanting out of this piece. It's okay to communicate that. What I recommend in these instances where you're having trouble describing specifically what it is you want, again, get on Google, get on Pinterest, get on Instagram, get on Facebook. You can even take pictures of stuff while you're walking the aisles of your local supermarket or grocery supply store or wherever it is you're at. If you see something that jumps out that says, wow, I really like this branding and packaging. Actually, I want this to be, that's it. Take a picture of that and share it with your designer because that helps you to not have to learn all the language. That lets them be the professional. Like we actually, one of our internal channels in our communication platform at Church Media Squad, we have a font favorite channel. And I see designers all the time popping in there saying, hey, they're asking for a font similar to this. Anybody got any suggestions? And they'll throw up the picture that the pastor or the creative director or the person that they're communicating with gave to them. And the designers just go nuts over this. No, try this one. This one's actually a better fit. This one works. Let them be the professionals and figure that out. You don't have to know that this is Helvetica. You don't have to know that, and that's such a vanilla font, and I'm sorry that that's the only one that I can pull out. But you don't have to know what that font is specifically, okay? You can use those tools that you have at your disposal through looking at what everybody else is doing and use that as a communication platform to launch on to get the designer to mash several elements together. Give them an example of the fonts that you want used. Give them an example. Hey, I love the use of imagery in this photo. I love the use of imagery in this design. I love the color scheme in this. That gives your designer the direction to go with. So I told you guys that I'm not actually a graphic designer. My wife, however, is. And she said to me one time, she said, never, ever, ever tell me to think outside the box. Give me a box to play with and I will build you a rocket ship, but do not tell me to think outside the box.
Yes.
So doing that legwork, figuring out that imagery, figuring out that color scheme, the way that you want it. Like some things just like, hey, I want this to move from dark to light because our Easter sermon series is on dark to light. So I want there to be a gradient map of darker colors on the left side, moving to lighter colors on the right side of this. We do want this to feel a little bit heavier. Giving those subjective words can help to set the overall tone of the piece when you're establishing the vision. Right. Once the concept is delivered, then you can segue into that specific feedback of saying, this font's not quite nailing it for me. This color scheme's not quite working here. Can we try this instead of this?
Right.
And it's okay to do that. It's very much okay to do that. I feel like that kind of answers that question in a loop about kind of way.
It certainly does. And I think that especially your point about not being too vague, because I have done some design work and people always think they're doing you a favor when they say, do whatever you want. Make me anything you want. You know, I don't care. Use it's up to your creativity. And I'm like, that's super overwhelming because I don't really know what you're looking for. And especially if you're working with an outsourced or a freelance, you know, someone who's not in your church, who doesn't know the feel or the vibe or like the things that you already have in place, that's very overwhelming. And that people think it takes less work, but it's actually way more work when you don't have those boundaries in place for you to like play with inside of. So
100%. And I would say that beyond that, and even if you've got an on-staff graphic designer, somebody that you know fairly well that's been attending your church for a few years and been on staff for a couple years, be very, very careful telling them they have creative freedom on that project. Be very careful with that because it can lead to a lot of frustration on there. And number one, it's overwhelming.
Of course, yeah.
Number two, I don't know that I've ever really seen it work out well.
Yeah.
Like as good as that designer is, they're there to execute your vision on something. And unless if they're sitting in, which I mean, you should be having your graphic designer sit in on those creative vision meetings if they're on staff with you. If you're outsourcing, you don't quite have that luxury. So you have to do a little bit more work on explaining the vision. But if they're on staff with you, if they're in the creative vision meetings where some of those buzzwords and hype words are being thrown around, then it might be a little bit more okay to say, hey, do you have any ideas on this? Do you have a direction that you think you can run? Or do we need to pin this down a little bit farther for you on this?
Right.
Ask them that. Open up that line of communication, because if you just say you've got creative freedom on this, then they're like, okay, then they do get a little bit more personally invested.
Yes.
And if you are presented with something that it's like, oh no, I hate this.
This is so bad. Yeah.
This is not it at
right.
all. Now it does almost become personal. Yeah. Now it does almost hurt a little bit when you say, nope, I don't like this at all. Because now it's like, well, you told me I have creative freedom, so I'm pouring myself into this project. If you wanted something, you should have been more specific about it instead of giving that to me. When you're working with a remote design team, don't do that until you're 40, 50, 60 projects deep with that one specific designer where you've worked with them a ton and you feel like you know them and they know you. And like within the first handful of projects at Church Media Squad, don't ever tell your designer full creative freedom. I've never seen it end well.
No.
I just never have.
No, I can't imagine that would work well.
No, it does not. Yeah.
Well, cool. Are there any other further recommendations moving past those? So the 4 elements, I think that's super helpful. We've gotten some specific language now to help us communicate, which is super important. We've also talked about how important it is to have open communication about it. Like you said, whether you have a designer on staff, whether you're communicating and setting up those expectations on the front end, you know, sort of defining and lining that out before you start working on the project. Do you have any further recommendations beyond what we've already covered?
Yeah, the one thing that's popping back up in terms of giving direction, in terms of giving feedback, try to avoid super vague terminologies. When you're looking at a concept and saying this doesn't look modern enough, that's going to mean a dozen different things to a dozen different people. And trying to get your designer to get into your head and see what you're seeing out of that, make it pop. is another one that we hear and we joke about all the time. What does that even mean? Does it mean that we're having a legibility issue because the fonts and the exact message or the title or the details that you're trying to convey are maybe too tonally similar to the background and they're not legible enough? Is it a legibility issue? Or is it this imagery that's used is not dynamic enough, is not dramatic enough to convey what we're wanting, so make it pop? Is the color scheme not popping enough because you're wanting more bright, heavy, beautiful colors instead of more subdued, muted, earthy tones? I'm not a designer, and that means any one of those different things to me.
That was just 3, but it could mean a million different things.
It could mean a million different things, and every designer is going to take that differently. So when they look at it, sometimes your designer, if you've worked with them enough, they might be able to interpret that as saying, oh yeah, shoot, there is a contrast issue there. Sorry, let me separate those fonts from the background a little bit more. And you're actually saying everything else is fine, just separate those fonts. When you have that relationship developed solidly, you might be able to get away with that. But super subjective terminologies make it look more modern. That could mean anything like you actually want it to be mid-century modern, which is kind of a 1950s-esque vibe out of that. Or do you want it to look more trendy, which changes daily? Like what is it that you're going for? And that's, again, we'll circle back to this again. With the availability of media that is online today, it should be simple enough for you to go online and find an image that is an example of what you mean. This is what I mean. Then your designer can look at that and say, oh, you actually like a very minimalist style of design. And minimalist is even kind of subjective in our world today as well. But if they're doing something that's super text and grunge heavy and lots of textures and lots of imagery, and you're wanting something that's minimal, showing them that picture, then they can circle back, redo the design. And you didn't have to go to college for design in order to communicate that. You just had to spend 10 or 15 minutes on Google.
Yes, definitely.
Or Pinterest or Instagram or Facebook or wherever you find your social media, right?
There's so many resources available now. And as we talked about earlier, there is a different level of expectation that people expect to see even from churches. So as we kind of come back around to all of that, maybe you could just touch on the importance and the benefits of really good professional design versus like the dangers or the ways that you might lose people if you're not dedicated, if you're not intentional about producing content that is high quality and excellent.
Yeah, it does come down to a lot of that spirit of excellence. There is a lot of stuff that like, hey, I get it. We're a small church. We don't have access to a lot of these resources. But in today's day and age, unprofessional media is felt.
Yes.
It is felt on a subconscious level to a place where people will actually shut you off if they don't feel that level of professionalism. If you're not there and don't have that level of professionalism to rely on, or you don't have the resources available to pull on that, shift gears and maybe try to develop a more authentic presentation of you, of your church, of your organization, of who you are, rather than trying to rely on design to do that. Because if you don't have those resources, it almost in some ways, it would be better to not do it at all.
Right.
And to focus on doing something else well until you can get those resources available. Consistency within the message that you're trying to deliver is huge in today's world. If you are off-brand and regularly off-brand and regularly in many different directions off-brand, it goes back to what I was saying about trying to find your target audience and your target demographic. Who is it that you feel Jesus is calling you to reach? And I mean, yes, I know Jesus is calling you to reach the world. I get that, but let's narrow this down. What is Jerusalem for you? Like Jesus calls us to, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and into the ends of the world. What is your Jerusalem? Where is it? Where is your home base? Who are the people that you're trying to reach? And then develop your brand with the idea of reaching them, and then stay on brand until you are intentionally wanting to break your brand for a specific reason. Developing that brand consistency is huge. I've seen some churches come into Church Media Squad that they don't have a brand guide. And that's okay. Some churches play by those, some churches don't. But when I get the email that says, hey, we're having a lot of trouble landing on consistency within all of the graphics that we're getting back from you guys, I take, excuse me, I take a look at it, and they're working with the same designer, but they have several different people that are submitting graphic requests that are all moving in different directions. So one of the things that we found really works is develop what's called a mood board. This is where you can, Pinterest is about the easiest spot to do this with, but you can go onto Pinterest, you create a mood board, and you just start scrolling through all of the church media that you can find. And as soon as you find an image that's like, yes, that's our church, you put it on that board. You find another one, yes, that's our church. Yes, that's our church. You're intentionally leaving out everything that's not. But when you get into it and you get a collection of images together that's like, yes, this represents the style and brand of our church, number one, it's going to help those graphic artists that you work with be able to hone in on that. And it's also going to create the consistency in that tone that will allow you to regularly reach your target demographic and convey the consistency in the message that you're trying to send out.
Definitely. That is super helpful. And that is, I like how precise we're getting into things. I'm loving all of these examples because I feel like a lot of people who maybe don't speak this language, haven't been to school for it, don't have a creative background. They just don't have the words for it. They don't have the ways to communicate about it. And maybe it's not that they don't want to, or they don't want to learn, but maybe they just don't know where to start. So if anyone is interested in connecting further with Church Media Squad or learning more, what's a good way for them to connect with you?
So first things first, at Church Media Squad, we do have a 14-day free trial, and it is genuinely a 14-day free trial. Go sign up for that. There's no obligation to continue past your trial. As part of that, I will actually reach out to you directly. I send you a welcome email, an opportunity to schedule a video call with me. I jump in. I go over a lot of this stuff on a one-on-one basis with you and talk about some of those best practices and tips. I teach you about our systems and processes, so that way you get kind of the idea of what to expect with Church Media Squad. But beyond that, I like developing that personal relationship, giving you the ability to ask and have answered questions like, what direction should I take this? How do we best communicate? Getting that on a more nuanced level. Right. I'm happy to set up those calls. I'm happy to work with you one-on-one. And I even continue that relationship beyond the trial. Once you're a member of Church Media Squad, I reach out to you pretty regularly. Hey, what's going on? Let's check in. Let's have a conversation. You can reach out to me. Hey, this project didn't go well. Am I communicating poorly? Right. Is there things that I could be doing better? I've seen a lot of churches come through that it's like, we walk them through this. Within 3 months, they're catching their stride on working with a remote design team. They're getting their graphic design needs filled. And the most honorable compliment that I've ever gotten, there's two of them. Recently, one person told me that we helped bring back work-life balance for her.
Love that.
Another one said that they were now able to pour into developing their team and focusing on their team instead of spending time at their computer and Photoshop doing design work.
That's incredible.
It is the biggest honor and biggest compliment that we are literally helping people do ministry better by taking this work and letting, sometimes professionals exist for a reason.
Yes.
So
yes. Yes. Well, that's incredible. We will be sure to put the links that you mentioned below, ways that you can get in touch with Church Media Squad and Japheth. We'll also include some links to some other resources that maybe will help you get started. Maybe an example. I think you guys have an example of a Pinterest mood board, some places that people can get some ideas and stuff. So we'll be sure to drop some of that below. Japheth, thank you so much for being with me today. I think this was so helpful and so needed. And I really think that you guys at Church Media Squad are really doing some amazing work. And I think this content was super, super helpful. So thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you. Again, it's my pleasure. It's my privilege and honor. And pastors, thank you so much for just allowing us this moment to speak into your lives. And hopefully there's been some little takeaway for you here. I appreciate that opportunity so much. So very, very much. Thank you.